Hey,
Hey,
we're back.
long break.
It was like 2 weeks. And I know last time I told you that the next week's episode was going to be about a monitored cycle. We went out of town, we were sick when we got back, and now here we are. So I do have an old podcast episode about a monitored cycle if you want to go listen to that. But we're going to be going through monitoring cycles in a month or two. So I figured we can kind of take you along that journey while we're going through it. So if you want an immediate update on that, go to a past podcast episode. But today we're going to talk about grief. Grief while going through infertility. Stephen and I went to couples therapy yesterday. Big advocates for therapy. Big advocates. You want to share? You're so quiet over there.
I mean, yeah, I've always have been. I guess I'm more of a processor, but I think we just needed it going into not being able to try for the next month or so, and kind of what we feel is a missed opportunity here. And
yeah, well, and just life in general. I mean, life is hard. Marriage is hard. We all have our own crosses we have to bear. And I mean, we have a whole episode on therapy and how important we have found it and to just help us continue to grow in a strong Christian loving marriage. And it's not always easy. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So therapy has been huge. We go individually and as a couple. And yesterday when we were in therapy, something that just really stuck out to me and was kind of like an aha yet overwhelming moment was talking about grief while going through infertility. And I don't know what your thoughts are on it all, so we can kind of dive into it today and talk through it. But something our therapist said was when someone goes through grief, it's normally just like one grief process you go through. You obviously could be grieving for a long time because I don't think grief ever goes away, but it's generally like one grief process you go through. But while going through infertility, you go through several grief processes, and it just it really feels like it never ends. And I've never really put my finger on that before because I always am like, oh yeah, infertility has its ups and downs, like it's sad, it's hard, but I've never thought of them as like different grief processes you're going through.
I mean, he put it best like this, basically, that if someone, let's say, tragically passes, right, you'll go through, it could be over a long period of time with that initial grief process, but usually it doesn't come back up until maybe an anniversary or something, and then it's like a reprocessing of it, or maybe it's like, oh, this would have been there, the time they graduated, or this would have been, and then you have to process it again because you're grieving over now the lost opportunity of that event, that future life event. And so I did like it because I do think that each time we get the chance to try, or we have a surgery, or we think, we found something and then it still doesn't work, I think that's what then churns through. It's like, oh man, I got to kind of, it hits you again that, you had the hope in that new moment, that new thing, and it's ripped away again. Yeah.
And it was just I don't know, very eye-opening to be like, oh my gosh, every cycle you go through a new grief process. You go through the trauma because your hopes are high, you're excited, you think this could be the one, and then all of a sudden it's not. And then you're grieving what you thought and hoped. And then also through infertility, you grieve so many things. So many things. Grieving, I mean, where do you begin? For instance, for us, the miscarriage. And I feel like every summer I go through bits of grief yet again. It revisits itself like we talked about every summer for me. And then, you're grieving what you thought your life would be like or should be like, whether you've had loss or not. I've grieved how many children I thought I was going to be able to have and when we would be able to have them. I've grieved, where I thought we would be in life right now with our kids. I've grieved not fully, but I've began to process the thought of, will we ever be able to know what our biological child will look like? I've grieved the thought of well, again, just the beginning of it, of like being able to be pregnant and staying pregnant and going through childbirth, grieving how you thought you would have kids. And I think that's a really big one because, I've shared so many times, Stephen and I have decided in January, if we're still not pregnant, we're going to pursue adoption. And sometimes I don't love sharing that that's hard for me because people are like, oh, well, then maybe it's not time. Like, give yourself more time. But the thing is, it doesn't matter if we were to pursue adoption tomorrow or we were to pursue adoption 5-10 years from now. I would still go through the grief process.
Well, yeah, because in my worldview of this, adoption's a great thing, and I think we would find a lot of joy in it, and we want
Absolutely.
that. But there is a unique, and I'm not trying to put better, but there's a unique experience of, like you said, seeing your own kid, like, sharing the DNA, like just looking at seeing, you and your daughter, or me and the son, or whatever way it goes. And that's a special experience. So you grieve that while still looking forward, I think, to the new opportunity. But the sadness is still there of that thought of, oh no, like, we both truly do want a biological kid. Like, that would be amazing. But we also would love any kid into our family, if not. But to your point, it's
not like you would love any other child less. It's just, it's different.
It's
just different. And no one can deny that. Like, it's just different, right? And when you're going through this grief, sometimes you can grieve multiple things at once. And I've been really feeling that. Like, I've been feeling very overwhelmed and like emotional lately, and I haven't really understood why until we went to therapy yesterday. And he was like, well, you're grieving so many things right now. You're grieving, the thought of what if these next 4 months you aren't able to get pregnant, and it is time to close the door because in the state of Texas you cannot pursue adoption while pursuing fertility treatment. So I see a NAPRO doctor, and that means I couldn't be seeing her doing medications or doing monitored cycles or anything like that. So, you're grieving the 3.5 years of hard work we have put in to try and get pregnant, and just it being so out of our control. And that's another thing, like, it's so out of our control.
Yeah. And
it's so hard. Like, infertility is so freaking hard. But knowing that, like, you're going through multiple grief processes, and something that recently has been like heavy on my heart is I was having a conversation with my mom not that long ago, and we were talking about my grandma, so her mom, who we call Nanny. And like the first memories I have of Nanny was when I was like 5. And she used to always come over to my mom's house and watch us. And then she would take us to Tom Thumb, where she would get her cigarettes and she would let us pick out a treat. And she would only take one sibling at a time. So it was kind of like a rotation. Because I had 2 older brothers and a younger, actually my younger sister wasn't alive at this point. Yeah. She's 7 years younger than me. So yeah, it was my 2 older brothers and me. So she'd come over 3 times a week and it would be one of our turns to go. And that's like the first memories I have of her. And when I was talking to my mom, I was like, how old was Nanny when I was 5? And she was like, oh, she was 65. And it kind of just made my heart sink, because I was like, oh my gosh, my mom just turned 61. And my nanny got early onset dementia. My mom said at the age of, I think, 65. Or maybe it was 60. I can't remember. But it didn't get bad until her late 60s. So, I have some early memories of her, probably from like 5 to like 7 or 8. But then she really wasn't like a grandma that you would think of, right? Like, she had dementia. She was deteriorating. Like, she just wasn't all there, which is so sad to watch before your eyes as well.
Yeah.
She did live up until I was, I think, a freshman or sophomore in college. But like all those years, like, I don't remember her really ever coming to any like grandparents' days or anything like that. And anyways, just thinking about this made me really sad, because it's like, you want to have kids that remember their grandparents.
Yeah. Well, we've both come from that background as well, where like that was a big driver for me too, of I had my grandma and my great grandma were the only grandparents I ever met or have memories of, because that's on my dad's side. My dad's father was out of the picture and then I think passed. And so I never met him. And then on my mom's side, both of my my grandpa and my grandma both passed away, I think both from cancer, right around in their 60s. And I was, I was like a couple months old to a year old when they passed. So I really just never got the chance to have grandparents like that. And so I do, look forward to that. And I still have a huge hope for it. But to your point, as you get further along, you're like, I just don't want to miss this opportunity for the better years. Because, you get older.
Better years. That's a good way to put it.
Yeah, because my dad's 72. So, like, my dad's older on his own right. So
I
it's
thought
like...
he was in his mid-70s. Is he 72? Mm-hmm. Oh.
Yeah.
I thought he was like 75, 76.
Not that old, no.
Oh, okay.
But, yeah, so, like, you want that stuff for your kids, rightfully so. So, it is... you're talking about like grieving different things. Mm-hmm. I don't know if it's good. I don't have a recommendation on what's good or bad or the right way to process. We do it very differently. And I thought we should talk about this, where I feel like she grieves and does this in the moment. It hits you much sooner. It like you're thinking about it, you're, forecasting, you're seeing that. And for me, I kind of like take my time to get there, and then it all hits me at once. Usually.
Yeah, like I don't think you've really grieved any of these, or I would say majority of the things that I have began to grieve, or have grieved in general. And that's okay. Like everyone processes things different or whatever, but there is also a piece of that too that's hard to see your partner grieving. Mm-hmm. And, I know you see it with me going through it now. Like yesterday at therapy when I was crying, like I saw you over there, like, you just want to help, but you can't. Like, you just want to, like, save the day, but you can't do anything. And then I know for you, when I've seen... Because I do think more recently, you have really began to show me the grief of, like, oh, wow, maybe this isn't how we're going to be able to have the family that I thought we were going to be able to have. And, we do want more than one child. And... that's also something wild to think about too, because yesterday at therapy, when we were talking about adoption, it kind of hit me too of like, oh gosh, we want more than one child. Like, are we going to have to go through this adoption process multiple times?
Yeah, I've slowly become more malleable maybe to God's will and say, okay, I'm out of control here. But in my little ideal world, sure, I wanted a lot of kids. And then secondly, I wanted kids in a cluster in terms of like pretty rapidly. Like I'm not someone who's like, okay, I want to wait for long years. I want them to grow up truly as siblings, right? And so I know that's, you can't force that stuff even if you don't have fertility issues. Sometimes it's hard or whatever life circumstances. But yeah, with adoption, to your point, okay, we adopt a kid, and then do we go back to just trying and try and like, okay, have a biological kid and like have them close, but what if we're still not finding success? And then how quickly do we, adopt again? Because, I want a large family, and I'm not going to wait and just have, I don't want that adopted kid like growing up alone while we wait to try and have biological kids. So
yeah, and I think that's just something that truly we have to just give to God, because I don't know how else you process that or how else you deal with it. Besides, you have to just give it to him and trust his plan and see how things go and work out. And I feel like we should kind of address this, maybe not on a super deep analytical level, but I get asked every single day, multiple times a day, why are we not going to pursue IVF before adoption? Like, why would you grieve the thought of having biological children when there is still science that can help you have biological children?
Right.
And a few reasons here. Number one being we're Catholic. So it is something that our faith... Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
I mean, I firmly believe in it. Yeah, I'm a practicing Catholic in terms of like all the dogmas and, the theory or the logic behind it, or the theology, I should say, behind it is just it's... Now you're doing kind of artificial conception outside of the womb, which is the big no-no. It's the same thing for, why you wouldn't try and have sex out of marriage. Like the purpose of intercourse is for one, enjoyment. Actually, that's a part of it in theology, but two, procreation, right? So those two things together. So, taking it outside of that, I get science can do it. It's just not a path I'm willing to go. I'll speak for you here. We don't judge other people who do it, right?
No,
I mean, we have there's different religious standards out there. There's people who, I think a lot of Muslims don't eat pork or whatever, right? There's different things. It's just a different in belief systems here. And
yeah. And let me tell you, it's not easy.
Oh,
there have been so many times where I'm like, why? Why? Like, and even some people will come to me and be like, do you really think when you get to the gates of heaven, God's going to tell you, you can't come in because you had a child through science? And honestly, I don't know the answer to that.
Well, I think God's full of forgiveness and mercy, but
absolutely. But there are also so many other reasons why we're not doing IVF too, right? I mean, of course, our faith is a big one. And I think this is a really hard one to understand when it comes to faith too, because not a lot of people agree with the Catholic faith, and to each their own, right? Stephen hates that phrase so much, but to each their own. But hopefully we can at least respect each other's decisions and faiths. I think like you don't have to agree with what we're doing, but hopefully you can just respect it.
Yeah, I mean,
and go ahead.
I was going to say, people are going to disagree with me and we're going to disagree with people.
Yeah,
I mean,
absolutely.
It's a mutual, but I've had good conversations with people who are going through IVF, and it's just a good conversation and they're sharing their point of view. And I'm a pretty big person. Like, as long as it's not harming me, like I'm staying out of your life. Like I don't need to judge every aspect of you. And you don't need to do the same for us.
And again, like we don't judge people or think poorly upon people or think we're better than anyone that does IVF. My sister-in-law is here today because of IVF, and it's just something that we just aren't on board with for so many reasons, including our faith. But I think that's a big one to address. Another one is someone once told me who has gone through IVF, and she waited, I think, like 7 or 8 years before doing IVF. And she said, if you and your husband are not both 100% on board to go through IVF, do not do it. And I think that's huge. And honestly, I'm not even 100% on board.
Well, for me, and look, I'm not the IVF expert because I don't dig into it too much. I know there's different ways to achieve it and different ways to do it, but I do have, you're saying it's not just the faith. I would say outside of that, there's just some practices that are common practices, it seems, where it's like you're freezing embryos. And it's not just like one, like you're doing all these things that I'm not really a fan of, or you're discarding them or whatever it is, right? I just, that stuff kind of eats at me. So it's just not for me, right?
Yeah. And I think also, again, it's just each their own, right? And this is just kind of where we stand. Again, I get asked all the time about IVF, and, some people ask nicely and some people ask not so nicely. But I think at the end of the day, people just want to stop seeing us suffer and seeing us help. But here's another thing. If we would have pursued IVF anytime within these last 3 years, it wouldn't have worked. It wouldn't have worked. I've had infections in my uterus. I have viruses in my uterus. There have been so many things that would have not allowed it to work. And I remember, I think it was like around the 1 year mark of us trying, and we had been, or maybe it was the 1 year mark since our miscarriage, whatever. Trying, we went through all the testing, everything came back normal, and RE, reproductive endocrinologist, reached out to me on social media, and they're like, I'd love to just chat with you about, IVF and what your options look like. And I remember I took the call and sat down with him, and he literally told me like, IVF is your only option. He had no data to go off of, by the way, absolutely none. And it was something that it doesn't matter if it was an RE or someone else. Like, I didn't feel cared for. I didn't feel like, he was advocating for me. I didn't feel any of these things. And it was something that I just was like, and at that time, I didn't really know much about IVF whatsoever. So it wasn't even like I was against IVF or anything like that. But I was just like, I don't like this vibe.
I have a strong opinion here that is not, I don't know if it's hers, but it's like, it does give off the big pharma vibe in a lot of ways, where it's like, even when you look at company benefits, it'll be like, oh, we'll give you $75K towards IVF, but $10K towards adoption. So there's a lot of money in IVF. And I think just like where there's a lot of money in anything, there's corruption. That doesn't mean everyone doing it is that way, but there's certainly practices, doctors, just different groups that, they want to pull in, whether it's insurance money or whatever it is, to do IVF treatments. There's a ton of money in it. It's just more so than adoption or other means.
Right, exactly. And I think that's why it's just so important to find a doctor that cares, whether you're going through IVF or not. Finding a doctor that cares is it will seriously make your experience 1,000 times different and more beautiful and exciting. This was not supposed to become an IVF conversation, but here we are. I think it's good to address it and talk about it.
And we were talking about it in the ways of grief. Like, we truly believe it's not for us, but we also do see like, oh man, that like, I mean, you said we might not have been able to because of the different things, but we did be like, oh, I know there's a way that's like, high percentage chance. So like, you have to grieve like, okay, we're giving that up. We're sacrificing that.
Right. And Stephen said this not that long ago, and it has stuck with me. Like, choosing not to do IVF is a sacrifice.
Yeah, it's a sacrifice for us.
And it sucks. I'm not gonna lie. Like, it does suck. And like, I think, I will wonder, and sometimes I wish we could just find that one priest that will say, hey, it's okay.
Which
go
for it. Easily.
Yeah, which you definitely could. But again, it's not just about our faith. There's just so many other things. Like, we don't agree with every step of it. We don't, I'm not 100% ready to do that or feel comfortable with doing it. I know you aren't. So, there's also the chance of like, it's not a guarantee. It's not a guarantee. And I think so many people who have never gone through infertility and maybe aren't educated on it, they see so many people that can't get pregnant do IVF and have their babies. So they just assume like, why wouldn't you do IVF? Well, it's not a guarantee. And I can almost guarantee you, because I've talked to many doctors in the past 3 years that have told me if you were to have gone forth and did IVF, it wouldn't have worked. So think of all that money that we would have washed down the drain. This is also why I'm a huge advocate of getting to the root of what's going on, no matter what your next steps are. But getting to the root, so know you have the best chance, whether it is trying naturally, doing IUI or doing IVF.
Yeah.
But it's so, so, so important. And that's why like I am such a believer in Fertilisys, this company I have been working with since the end of the year, and I've done testing through myself. That's why we're headed to Greece here in, I know, I'm so excited. I think next week, or no, once we get back, we'll talk all about Greece and all of that. But so excited because they really are all about like getting to the root, figuring out things that a lot of doctors here in the US just aren't educated on or don't know how to find, and like microbiome and reproductive immunology and all of these things. So it's exciting to get to these next steps, but, going back to the topic of grief with adoption and IVF, like no matter what your next steps are, maybe it's IUI, it's embryo adoption, it's IVF, it's adoption, whatever it is, like you most likely are going to go through a stage of grief because that's not how you imagined you were going to grow your family. So us taking the next steps to pursue adoption, like we are just so ready. I got asked in a question box last week of like, do you think you're giving your body enough time with after like the treatment and the herbs, like treatment in Greece, herbs that we're doing, like only giving yourself 4 cycles. Do you think you're giving yourself enough time before you pursue adoption? And I'll be honest, I have toyed with that idea a lot and have gone back and forth with that too. But the bottom line is, okay, it's about a 25% chance each cycle to get pregnant, right?
For, completely
if
healthy
everything's
woman.
completely healthy. There have been so many times that we have been told, once you get rid of this, once you get rid of that, once you have the surgery, your chances highly increase to conceive.
Yeah, but I would even go beyond that in terms of this like decision here is when January to adopt is like to start the process.
Right.
I mean, that's 9 months, 16 months, whatever. It's a long time.
But I think people are saying like to stop pursuing fertility treatment. But we're kind of at the whole point of this is me saying like, we're kind of at the point where like, we have done it all.
Yeah, because I think
that we're comfortable with.
After Greece, I mean, you'll have done whatever happens there, whatever we like find and do that. We might be able to do a monitor cycle in between. And then it's like, okay, exactly. Like what else?
Yeah, I mean, we're going to do monitored
So
cycles September, October, November, December to like see what everything is going on. And I think at that point, we're going to be like, okay, we've done it all. We've tried everything that we are comfortable with and that we think would help us in the ways. I have to sneeze. Thank you. That we're comfortable with everything that we have, to move forward. And we're also just ready. We are ready for the next stage in life. We have been going through infertility for, at that point, almost 4 years. And to some that may seem like forever, to some that may seem like not very long at all. But to us, I have fought tooth and nail. I'm going to get emotional. I have fought tooth and nail these past 3.5 years to help my body get and stay pregnant. And I'm at a point where I am exhausted. I'm at a point where I just don't want to, not that I want to give up, because I don't think we'll ever give up on trying naturally, but I just want to get to the next stage in life. I want to be able to feel the fulfillment of having children, however that may be. I want to be able to just move forward in that way. And I know you do too. Mm. And this has been a conversation that we have had for probably the past like year plus about like when to pursue adoption. Because at once upon a time, we did say my 30th birthday, which is in like 3 weeks. Mm-hmm. But that was before we took a break and did the herbs and all of this stuff. So, you know, we're just at a point where like, just so ready to move forward and move into this next stage of life and raise children. Yeah.
I mean, I see it most, and I'm sure you do too, when we're around our nieces and nephews and all that stuff. And it's just like, we're so excited to be around them because, I mean, that is what I wanted to be around. You know, we've been done with the bar scene. Like, that's been gone for a long time. Like, that's not really us. You know, sure, like, I love to golf. I love my free time. There's many benefits of being a dual income, like, family without a kid. Like, there's tons that you can leverage. And they're all great, but I'm ready to transition, you know, over to having kids and, you know, I know it's going to get tough, but like going around their schedule and just, I don't know, just having little kids running around the house.
Right. And I do think like we will go through a process of grief. I mean, as you can tell, I'm emotional now because I kind of feel like I'm already starting to go through those steps of grief of like, you know, how hard I've worked. And, you know, I don't think it's all for nothing because I've learned so much about my body and my health and these things that I would have never known. But I hope and pray that God will bless us with biological children as well. And, you know, I've always felt deep within my heart, we will be able to get pregnant. Mm-hmm. And I don't know why, because you would think after this long, it's like, how could you hold on to hope? But I mean, I think the answer is God, but I really have felt that way. And I'm like one day. And also, you know, we have found fulfillment and meaning in our time of waiting. And, you know, I've kind of talked about grief and everything on my social media recently. And people came to me and told me that, you know, you have to find your identity and fulfillment outside of children.
Yeah, you do.
Which I think we have.
Yeah, it's the same. I think, you know, as a Christian, it's like, one, you can try and find your identity fulfillment in work, in your spouse, in children, and whatever it is. The highest one, in my opinion, is always going to be God. And that's going to be the biggest hole. So, you know, you've got to build that relationship. You've got to build the relationship between us and, like you said, hobbies, work. You got to build it all. So, yeah, it's not a useless time, this time that we've been waiting and trying, right? There's definitely positive aspects that we've been able to grow because of.
Yeah, for sure. And I think we'll do a whole episode on adoption and all of that at some point, too.
I think we should, once we get through it, because I feel like we should, you know, give out information as we're going through it.
I mean, like, you know, more diving into our thoughts around it and moving forward with it and all of that, because adoption is something Stephen and I have both wanted to do for, well, I know my whole life.
Not my whole life. I was more so on, I envisioned myself doing more like fostering later on. Mm-hmm. I think we talked about that. I was more so like, I came to like adoption is a good thing. You were definitely always on board.
I remember on our first date, I said, I'm interested in adopting. Like, are you? And because if not, it was going to be a deal breaker.
And I said, I already have parents, but I guess you can adopt me.
But he was like, yeah, I am. Like, I'm open to it. I mean, obviously, it was like a very brief conversation. Mm-hmm. It wasn't anything too in depth. But now that it's like kind of becoming a very real reality for us. It's been a conversation we've had for probably a year now, more seriously, of talking about it, diving into it, and all of that. But anyways, all of this to say is when you're on the road of infertility, grief is something you will deal with constantly. And something that really overwhelmed me yesterday was our therapist said, you have a lot of grief to go through ahead. And that because you like when you go through it, you want it to be over because you're like, shit, that was hard. Like that sucked. That was heavy. And you want it to be over. But then you're like, oh no, you got something else to grieve. And then there's something new. And you know, there's just so many things in life while going through infertility, you're grieving. And I feel like we're going through a lot, right? Or I'm going through a lot right now. It'll hit you eventually. I mean, we'll see what happens. But, it's like, oh my gosh, we have a lot to go through ahead.
Yeah.
Because then it's going to be the reality if we do pursue adoption. It's going to be the reality of, there's so many things. So many things. And then, baby number 2, 3, 4, whatever that looks like, so
5, 6.
That's why I think therapy is really great. Okay. That's why I think therapy is like really incredible too, to help you navigate it all.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
But I hope you're not alone. And if you've had these feelings of maybe you didn't realize it was grief and now you're like, oh wow, yeah, that's grief because that was me yesterday. Just know you're not alone and know there may be a long road ahead of us. And I mean, there will be a long road ahead of the majority of us. But just know like we can do it and all things are possible through God. And I feel like there's a never ending sense of peace with him. And if you have not going to try and get preachy here, but if he's not someone that's in your life, I would just really encourage you to try and seek him out in whatever way that looks like for you. Maybe it's opening the Bible. Maybe it's starting in the Bible app and starting a study. Infertility encouragement through Sarah's Laughter is one I share on my Instagram all the time. It's incredible. Maybe just praying, just talking to God. I always pray for peace and understanding and serenity through all of this. And I truly do feel that all the time. Praying as a couple is a beautiful, beautiful thing as well. And I don't know, just taking that step of what feels good for you, I'd really encourage it. Because to be honest, I don't know how anyone goes through infertility without God. I would be such a bitter, angry, jealous human being.
I would expand that to life in general, but yeah.
True.
Yeah.
Very true. But anyways, we appreciate you being here. If you want to leave a review, that would be phenomenal. If it's less than 4 stars, don't.
Okay, we're rigging the system.
I'm just kidding. I heard someone say that on a podcast once and it made me laugh. I was like, oh my gosh, that's so funny. Because now being on this side of doing podcasts, it's like, yeah, but like 5. The way people hear about us and like we can help other women and men and couples feel less alone on this journey is you sharing us on social media. We so appreciate that. My Instagram handle and TikTok handle is Adelaide_A White. You can always find me there. And, tagging us is so appreciated too. Steven's not on social media.
I'll read YouTube comments. So if you want to
leave those, leaving comments is very appreciated. Leaving reviews on our podcast, like so appreciated. So we thank you for being here. Thanks for crying with us, laughing with us, and, going through this journey with us. And we'll see you next week.
See you next week.